Here we are.
Hey,
Hello.
Ryan.
Hey, look,
Long
our
time no see.
showing up here on camera. Hey, Jeremiah.
Hey, everybody.
I'm going to bounce you out for a second and then introduce you formally. That way, he gets all of his accolades. John.
I know. Here we are again. We took a little bit of a break over Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and you took a nice little break in Oslo right before.
I wouldn't exactly call it a break. It was more like an Arctic death march of meetings. But Norway is great. It's a wonderful country. Everybody looks like a supermodel, and they're super nice. And innovation's a hot topic there, so nothing much to complain about.
Well, you fit right in. It sounds.
Well, you're very kind.
Our next guest, as you saw, is already here. Hopefully, I was able to connect some of our accounts here to make sure that everything's good. So, Jeremiah, if we might have to ask you back as well, so that we get you your maximum exposure for audience. But just having him here is really awesome. And he did also say in the back channel that it was a nice blues riff. And yes, Jeremiah, John did write that music, and he also has graced us with some live stuff and we actually would want more. So with that said, let's jump in. Welcome everyone to Intersections. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here. Every single week we bring together some of the most amazing thinkers, the most amazing artists, and we all come together in the greater service of understanding, learning, and unlearning. I'd like to introduce my co-host and co-founder, John Kao, who is now world traveled since the pandemic. I'm not there yet, but hope to be and hope to visit beautiful countries like Oslo. The Economist is called John Mr. Creativity. As you heard with our intro music, he's also quite the jazz musician and pianist. He's a Tony-nominated producer of film and stage. He wrote the best-selling book Jamming: The Art and Discipline of Business Creativity. More so, he has just been a pioneer in innovation. He's taught at Harvard Business School and served as visiting faculty at MIT Media Lab and Stanford. His accomplishments and also his student accomplishments are quite impressive and humbling. John, welcome to Intersections.
Hey, Brian, thanks for that generous introduction. I'm sort of the living proof that nonlinearity can have some benefits, maybe even pay off here and there. So Brian Solis, who's my partner in this enterprise, is from a formal title point of view, the global evangelist for innovation at Salesforce. But I hasten to point out that he's been a force in the whole digital arena and how digital applies to innovation, to marketing, the social media revolution, well before there was a general awareness that these were breaking trends that would evolve from being trends into the structure of life as we know it today. Brian expresses his thought leadership in multiple formats. He's a multimedia thought leader, best-selling books, Intersections show, live presentations around the world, in demand, and I would say is as much of the Economist calling him Mr. Creativity, but the nickname I like the best is Innovation Activist, and Brian is certainly my peer, if not my surpassing me in terms of being an innovation activist as well.
I like that, John. Innovation activist.
Yeah.
Let's hashtag that and own it from here on out. Well, it's an absolute pleasure. Our producer's not with us today, so I'll be driving a lot of the things in the show. And what I'd like to do is bring our first guest on, who's actually a long time friend, former business partner, founder of Kaleido Insights, just an all-around amazing dude, and former neighbor, Jeremiah Owyang. Jeremiah, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brian. John, nice to connect with you.
Great.
And it's always a pleasure to see your Airstream studio, of which you were ahead of the game before a pandemic.
Yes, it's been a godsend during this difficult time.
Well, Jeremiah, before we get going, if there's anybody out there who doesn't know who you are, maybe you could share with us what you're working on and a bit about your background.
Sure. Well, if you know Brian, you might know me because we've run in parallel circles and tracks for over a decade. I love technology, and one thing that I have is a career mission, and my career mission is to help companies connect to their customers using new technologies. And so I was there at the .com era. Brian and I met up in the social media era. It was called the business blogging when we first met. And also I covered the sharing collaborative economy, which is also peer-to-peer. And now I'm neck deep, eyeballs deep into Web 3.0.
Yes, Web 3.0, and I can't wait to talk to you about that today. I know John and I have so many questions because Web 3.0 actually goes back to a time where we worked together and started to do analysis around it as the semantic web back in the day, and the semantic web sort of, for those who aren't geeking out with us right now, the semantic web was sort of like a web of data that machines would be able to read and process and interpret the web for us. And with AI and machine learning, we would get an intelligent web of sorts. But that seemed to have sort of veered in a new direction with Web 3.0 sort of being aligned with things like NFTs, crypto, with DAOs, and all kinds of other acronyms that I could throw out, and people will scratch their heads. So maybe Jeremiah, you could kind of give us your working definition, or at least your working interpretation of the state of Web 3.0. And then we'll just jump in from there.
Yeah, so the semantic web, that is not really the moniker that's being used. And so really this iteration of Web 3.0, and I didn't come up with it, is really around the people who are taking control of the internet that they built. And the big thing is shifting away from centralized platforms like Facebook in particular is the target, versus now they are owning the web. So what do they own? They want to own their data, their identity, and they want to own the equity in what they do. So that first post, if you could scroll up a little bit, is kind of an idea of how I'm tracking the space on how many brands are also in the space. So the big companies, of course, follow the consumers. So Web 3.0 is about the participants, the people who participate and build content. They themselves are using crypto and blockchain, and they're self-organizing, and they're using NFTs to make communities, and they're building their own little organizations called DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations. And so a lot of this will seem very familiar to you, Brian, from Web 2.0, the community aspect. NFTs are images that can be purchased and shared. We did this, right, with Flickr and tools like that. So Web 3.0, the participants want to distribute the content, and they want to distribute ownership amongst themselves rather than rely on centralized Facebook or Google or PayPal or Visa.
Yeah. In many ways, the metaverse could be attached to Web 3.0 as well. And we see companies like Facebook shifting to Meta, sort of going against the Web 3.0 movement and trying to own a bit of that distributed web. And that in of itself sort of says why we need Web 3.0. And monikers aside, it's a pretty fascinating time for brands, for businesses, for creators, in that it's aiming to democratize that influence. And I think, like us hopeless optimists thought that Web 2.0 would do, and instead we saw the rise of big tech. But it's certainly interesting in what we're seeing. You might think of Ethereum, or you might think of Bitcoin. You might think of these incredible NFTs that people are sort of confused around. Is it an image? Is it a token? Is it an asset? And then you see movements like, for example, a distributed attempt to purchase a copy of the Constitution, which I thought was phenomenal, and ironically, I should say, only to lose to a hedge fund leader. So
you're making me laugh today because it's all so funny. All of it there's so much irony baked into this market. Absolutely. And it's actually quite fun to participate in this market, to see all these things happening. So we could talk also about, this movement when it comes to like the goals of the community. For example, they want to foster trust amongst each other. So they're using these tools to blockchain is a distributed ledger, think distributed database, where everybody can see who has what token, or who has what cryptocurrency, or who has which NFT. So that helps to broker trust rather than rely on Facebook, who has all of our data and they can change it on a whim or sell it to another country to do something with, right? So that is the trust aspect. The other part, and I know you know this well, is they want to build their own community to relate to each other. And certainly the pandemic really fostered that to help people to connect. So people acquired these NFTs, which are in many cases were images that they used as their profile photos. For example, the Bored Apes, you might have seen those in the media. Celebrities are buying those now. And Adidas just partnered with them this morning. That is, they're turning that into their profile photo. So in a way, it's a tribal banner to show that they have affinity to each other. So inclusion and community. So trust and community. And the third aspect is they want to monetize. And so they're generating revenues by creating the communities form, and they can either issue cryptocurrencies to the members, or they can make decisions with cryptocurrencies, and they can create new products or experiences, and then they sell them using cryptocurrencies. And they might even create new NFTs. So I've seen some tremendous, for example, some of the tokens from these DAOs, these communities, distributed autonomous organizations. Think, by the way, when you hear DAO, the easiest way to think of it is a digital cooperative or digital co-op, a co-op. Some of the returns are 25 times return in 1 week. I've seen that happen. It's incredible. So they're building trust, they're building their own communities, and they're monetizing, and they're doing it in a decentralized way, all on blockchain. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's super helpful. And John, before I turn it over to you, a couple of things is blockchain seems to be the common thread throughout all things Web 3.0. And you mentioned trust, and I think in that trust is sort of this accountability that we've been missing with Web 2.0, which I think is very promising here. And the idea that community is built upon a foundation of trust and accountability is unprecedented. And this if you're an innovator, if you're an executive and you're watching, like, hey, how do we need to play in Web 3.0? You don't just have to come up with an NFT. You could actually reimagine your total business value proposition and your services. Think finance, think insurance, think about this idea of creating a product or service that the transparency is actually baked in. Think governments, think voting. This has a lot of transformational opportunities for that Imagineer, for that innovator, and also for people who want to tell the truth, because that's another conversation we could get into otherwise. But John, before I throw it over to you, the last question I had for you, Jeremiah, is you also have your own coin, and so you've become essentially an NFT of sorts that can be traded, and because I actually love your avatar on your coin. So talk to us about this, because this essentially becomes a DAO for currency, in a sense that you have owners of your coin, and you're a community actually using that coin and the transactions of that coin to do things together.
Yes, that's right. So I'm using a platform called Rally.io, and Rally.io enables content creators, to have their own currency. And if we just harken back to Web 2.0, Brian, we used to be on stages telling people everybody will be their own media platform, right? Remember that? And now we've developed our communities. Every community will now have its own economy. And so I use my own coin, which is using my initials. Owyang is my last name, so it's JOW is the ticker symbol. And my community members or fans purchase that in order to access either services or goods or experiences, that I create as a creator. For example, they can access my time. Some of them have used it to purchase some of my time, and they use my coin to get this. The coin changes price over time as well. Also, they might access an experience. So I'm going to be setting up private communities for my members, or private Zoom chats to talk about the tech coverage that I'm doing. And I'm also sold a very silly NFT of, and I hired an artist to sell that. It's not selling like the Bored Apes by any means, but it's fun and I'm enjoying it. So I'm using this to build a microeconomy, and I'm also generating revenues for myself, which of course I would pay. I'll recognize it as taxes, as earned income.
Oh yeah, well, you should, because the IRS is actually one of our biggest viewers.
Hi.
I'd love a referral to that artist, because I also created an NFT that I'm sitting on, but it's missing sort of this element that I feel like that would bring it to the next level. And so we could talk about that later. But John, over to you.
Sure. Well, I'd love to kind of turn the conversation 180 degrees and pose the following kind of scenario. Imagine that there's a big company that's been an incumbent, and they have all of the assets and liabilities of being a big company. They have legacy, they have bureaucracy, but their challenge is basically to get awareness of the technology landscape. And this is what I've been referring to in some of the work I've been doing on the new intelligences of leaders as technological literacy, right? It's like, how do big companies get an accurate view of what's going on? And obviously you're in that game to a very significant degree. You come in and you speak a language that has to, in a sense, you have to hit the brakes a little bit just to kind of dock with where the corporate mainstream is. But I'm wondering what your recommendation would be to your, classic large incumbent company that's trying to make sense of the exploding advance of innovation in the technology landscape. What, aside from hiring you or hiring external consultants, what can they do to create an organic internal capability that will enable them to not be blindsided?
Sure. So, as a regular individual who uses the internet, they probably are using social media, and so it is the natural segue for them to also start to use the Web3 technologies. So perhaps they might want to acquire some cryptocurrencies. Not financial advice.
Right.
They might want to try to acquire some NFTs, and there's some very easy tools to use out there. For example, VV is an app that they can use, and you can use your credit card to buy NFTs. You don't have to go through the complicated cryptocurrency conversions. So that's another example. They could buy some the branded NFTs out there. For example, the Matrix is launching right now. People are minting that one. So go out there and actually participate. The second thing that they should do is to analyze where are their consumers and customers in the Web3 space. And so to understand how they are using those technologies, if at all. In some cases, they may not be. And I understand it's not for all demographics yet, but it will grow. It's with the early adopter community now. And then it's to take a real business approach if they're going to participate. Are they going to participate in order to, and these are the following business goals that I tend to see, it's for customer engagement. You can actually build a very thriving community or join a community. The second one is for customer loyalty. So Clinique launched an NFT, and the sponsor was the head of consumer engagement who runs the loyalty program. And in order to receive one of the NFTs, you had to sign up for the loyalty program. So it was used as a kind of like a dangling carrot. And the third one could be for innovation to create new products. So you were showing that image earlier where Adidas just partnered with the second largest NFT community called the Bored Apes. And they now have this digital virtual creative collaboration, and they may create virtual goods from that, or maybe even physical streetwear that could actually have the Bored Apes and Adidas logos together. By the way, the Bored Apes, there's around 10,000 NFTs, and there's also other sets. So it's actually a pretty thriving community, tens of thousands of engaged folks. So I hope that's helpful. And it was a real pragmatic approach of use it yourself, understand what your customers are doing, and then approach it with the business goals of customer engagement or loyalty or innovation. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is helpful. And I guess I want to dig a little bit deeper, because I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about who in this hypothetical big incumbent organization would carry the responsibility. I mean, let's make the assumption that central command, CEO, C-suite probably don't have time to do as much of the kind of sampling and experimentation as you're indicating. And I did a little back of the envelope survey at the Summer Davos a couple of years ago, where I created a questionnaire just of what I consider to be basic questions around literacy about new technologies. And I walked around and asked people randomly to fill out the questionnaire, and the level of knowledge was quite low, surprisingly low for a senior audience. So,
Yeah.
and let's assume also, I mean, my son who's 17 said that when he wanted to laugh a lot, he would get a grown up to try to explain what TikTok was. So,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
you
So
know, so how do you create
sure.
that literacy, that sensibility, which is in a way self-generating? Because once it's not just learning the facts about NFTs, it's about orienting yourself to an ongoing wave of
That's right.
technological innovation.
And there's going to be a new technology set, and then somebody's going to come up with the moniker Web 4.0, and so we'll have to get ready for that. So,
Yeah.
and then Web 3.0 dovetails into the metaverse, as Brian eloquently pointed out in the beginning of the show. So, the NFT assets are sold and used in the metaverse. So these things are going to happen in sequence. You just can't focus on one and expect to stay on top of it. So right now, the teams that are leading this are the head of digital marketing, which could include interactive marketing, partnered, this is important, with legal, because we're talking about equity, potentially the SEC, brand, partnerships, financial impacts to consumers. So I have not seen marketing so closely tied with legal in other digital marketing projects. This one is very different. And there's already teams that are being assembled called the Web3 teams within agencies first, and then in big brands, they're starting to hire people to do that. There's one specific group that has a natural tendency to lead in Web3 as well, is the head of community, because in many cases, Web 3.0 is about people forming communities, and the tokens or the NFT images or the cryptocurrency is what binds them. So I hope that helps.
Well, it's interesting because it sounds like what you're saying is that the need becomes a cross-functional, tiger team that is drawn from diverse disciplines, and it will probably have different constituents in different organizations, which again is an obstacle in a lot of companies, because that kind of cross-functional collaboration often isn't possible, or is practiced more in theory than in reality.
And in that case, they'll just hand it to the agency to manage with the blessing from the CMO.
Right.
For better or for worse. I mean, that's what often happens.
Right. But then a company's outsourcing its thinking and its ability to create, which means that its own internal roots of generating new ideas are going to wither. And it's
absolutely right. Or they'll become dependent upon their partners.
Yeah. So, you're in an interesting position, because you're, trying to fill the gap in terms of understanding between, this massive, it's the majority, really, the massive middle, so to speak, and what's going on. And one could imagine all kinds of new approaches to trying to create this kind of literacy. I mean, what I notice is that there are thousands of literally thousands, probably at this point, of people who have a bit of the equation to offer in terms of this is my insight, or this is my book, or this is whatever. But few people have your kind of integrated perspective to be able to kind of choreograph, in a way, not just the knowledge, but the strategic responses that come from that knowledge. And so one wonders about whether there are new ways for companies to get that kind of literacy and that kind of contextual intelligence without having to just outsource it, or send the senior C-suite to some weekend workshop where they get to dress differently and mess around with
exactly, and play foosball and sit on bouncy balls. So this has got to be woven into the daily usage of the people that are going to be leading this. Like, it's not something you can just pick up. Like this aspect of this digital culture needs to thread throughout the organization. I don't know. You actually have to do this stuff. The best way to learn it is to do it. And Brian used to speak and teach on this when it came to social media. He advised many executives on how to physically use social media, which helped them to see how they could get their teams to use it and then amplify the brand. And it's the same thing here.
Well, I look forward to learning more about your work, because I tend to traffic in the people who are trying to go from being slow incumbents to getting with new technologies. And although we've been focusing on digital, there's other disruptive waves of disruption occurring in in energy, material science, biology, and I find that it's not just about the accumulation of facts. It's really about a different mindset, which is both, as Kevin Kelly puts it, being an endless newbie. So being open to new things.
Always a student, never a master.
But also, having access to the right sources of information. And, the social web is just a jungle. I mean, I don't know what percentage you would say is the, the chaff versus the wheat, but I always find it very difficult to find authoritative sources of input that I would say, wow, that's highly curated, really intelligent. I want to keep looking at that. And I think that dilemma is compounded at the C-suite.
Yeah, so I am getting a lot of information in real time in social audio. So attending like pop-up Twitter spaces. And obviously this is a curated view that I see because it's based upon who I follow. So perhaps you could find the people I follow on Twitter and you can see, some of the folks that I'm leaning on to get signal from. That might be one way to do it. But then of course I'm keeping this list, as you can see on the screen, of what brands are doing in the NFT space, which is just only one component of Web3, by the way. And so I'm tracking this, and then I comment about it on Twitter as well, pointing to other people and resources.
Yeah, well, I can see why people are attracted to your ability to kind of curate and establish useful pattern recognition, because there are very few people out there who really do anything approaching a good job of that, I think.
Oh, that's high praise. Thank you, John.
All right. Well, with that happy note, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian to close out this part of the show. And thanks, Jeremiah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeremiah, thank you so much for being on. And we'd love to actually have you back sooner than later, because this is a real important conversation. And a place where I would want to pick it up would be sort of this idea, as brought up by John, is this idea of shifting not just from marketing, but also to digital innovation and hybrid innovation. So, for example, I was having a conversation around, like the exclusivity of the Hermes Birkin bag, and the idea of how hard it is to even get that bag, no matter how loyal or wonderful of a customer you are, and the ability to maybe create sort of like next gen Birkin bag attached to an NFT based on blockchain, so that the product doesn't just have tracked ownership, but that the product is also is hybrid, is that there's a version of the Birkin bag as an NFT as well. And I think that this creates this sort of open door for the future of luxury and the future of product in general, where it's not just a form of community, it's also a form of like you said, cooperation, it's ownership, and there's something really here, especially as the metaverse becomes more profound, especially with all of the real estate transactions that we're now starting to see with people buying to so that I think would be a wonderful place for us to pick up. And so I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and also awesome to see you always being ahead of the next trend and helping bring people along for the ride.
Thanks for the time, gentlemen.
Great to see you. Thanks.
Thank you. And on that note, John, I'm going to turn it over to you. I am going to run to my meeting, and make sure you have everything you need to take the show on.
I'm cool, Brian. Right. So what you might do for me is bring up our next guest, because I'm going to, among other things, ask her a very important initial question, which is, what is the proper pronunciation of her last name? So, Jean, how do I pronounce your last name?
It's pronounced twangy, like twangy guitar.
Twangy, great. Okay, so I'm glad I asked, because that would not have been my intuitive attempt to say your name. So, Brian, see you later. And with that, it's a pleasure to introduce Jean Twenge, who is a professor of psychology at UC San Diego, a prolific author, very impressive academic background, degrees from the University of Chicago and University of Michigan, and who has devoted much of her recent work to a topic that I'm sure we're going to make a meal out of, which is how the digital landscape and what she calls super connected young people, that the influence of the new technologies go far beyond what is obvious, and it really kind of shaped behavior and maybe shaped or reshaped what we as so-called adults might think of as adulthood in the current era. So welcome to the show. It's really
Thanks.
great to have you.
Thanks.
I empathize with your work on multiple levels. I actually did behavioral science in university and then got an MD and did a residency in psychiatry because I thought I wanted to be a Jungian psychoanalyst. So these issues of what goes on inside people's hearts and minds, are near and dear to my heart. And I guess we could just start first with a very basic question, which comes from your latest book, iGen: Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, which is certainly an innovative title for a book, but also raises a lot of questions. I mean, why would you say this, and what are you basing it on, and what is super connected, and how come not prepared for adulthood?
So iGen is those born roughly 1995 to 2012. So they're the first generation to spend their entire adolescence in the age of the smartphone. And that's where super connected comes from. That these days, when we think about the word connected, it's almost always connected to technology. So smartphones and social media have had an enormous impact on this generation from a very young age. It's shaped their view of the world. It has shaped how they relate to each other. It's shaped how they spend their time. And they're strikingly different from the millennials just before them, probably due to that large technological change.
And what do you see, first of all, the differences as being? I mean, I love that you said that, because one of my notes here to myself was ask her about why digital natives is no longer an adequate description, right? Because we're into micro-generational phenomena now determined by the technology. So super connected is, the smartphone social media set. Digital natives are just people who are using computers and gaming and getting into it, right? And do you think that's accurate, first of all? And do you see any other subdivisions that are relevant? And then let's dive into more of the specifics.
Yeah, I mean, millennials, so those born 1980 to 94, were often described as digital natives. Also, maybe some of the younger Gen Xers right before them. But you're right, being a digital native with a desktop computer is a very different thing from being a digital native with social media, with smartphones. It's a completely different experience to be communicating with people on a desktop computer versus a smartphone that you can carry around in your pocket. It can be taken into social situations, can be taken everywhere you go. Plus, the character of social media has really changed. When it was MySpace, say, back when millennials were the young people, the teens and young adults, it was kind of for fun. And there were people on there who certainly used it to seek attention and followers, but it was relatively optional. And as recently as 2009, only about half of high school students were using social media. And now it's almost everyone. So it's almost mandatory for teens and young adults. And even among some groups of older adults, it's almost mandatory that you use social media. So that's really changed its character from something that was kind of optional and maybe fun and something some people did to something that almost everybody does because they feel like they have to.
And what are the social media platforms that are most important as the glue for what you're describing?
Well, I think the platform doesn't matter quite as much as the experience of it being mandatory. But, with that said, teens today are using TikTok, obviously, and Instagram and Snapchat, and not as much Facebook. So Facebook, of course, used to be the dominant platform, but that has faded considerably among younger people.
Right, exactly. Obviously, they'll all come back when the metaverse becomes a reality. But meanwhile, Facebook's just not cool.
Right,
So
because their grandma's on Facebook.
right, exactly. So by definition, it's not where you want to be. So let's explore a little bit more this super connected generation, which I guess you're saying people born between 1995 and 2012. So people, I guess, who are like 9 to 15,
26.
16 years old.
26.
26. Yeah, sorry, my math skills are a little off today. So what differentiates them? If we want to dig a little bit deeper into that, what defines them as being a kind of a generation in relation to the technology that they're now? And I agree with you, by the way. I mean, I have a 17-year-old and a 21-year-old, and they're very engaged in mainstream activities like doing homework and playing the piano and doing sports. But they all also have, my hand-me-down iPhone 11 and iPhone 12, and they don't see it as being asocial or antisocial to be on it. But the fragmentation of attention is very obvious to me. I mean, my kids cannot, unless they're coerced, sit still for an entire feature film. Within about 30 minutes of watching a movie at home, they'll have their phones out. Mm-hmm. And they'll be multitasking, or they'll be texting to friends or whatever. And I try to explain that long form art requires long form attention, but they don't really take that seriously, because the vividness of the high resolution screen on the smartphone really competes with the resolution of the 4K TV screen. Or they don't do it in a movie theater because that's a constrained environment. But in every other sense, they seem very distracted. So what's special about the super connected generation?
Well, there's the attention things like you're describing, that there's a move away, not just from watching a movie, but especially reading a long magazine article, reading a book. They just don't do that, or can't do that. So many college faculty have noticed that, we have a generation, we know from big surveys, for example, that just doesn't read as much. At least they don't read long form text. And then they come to campus, and the first thing that we do is hand them an 800-page printed textbook.
Yeah, right.
So, and that's started to change. There's now ebooks and things that are more interactive. But there's still this enormous disconnect between how they learn to think and then what is still expected of them in college and in the workplace. So one of the other things that really distinguishes iGen from millennials is optimism and mental health. And I think social media is at the root of this, that we could talk about a little bit more. But just looking at the differences, millennials, very self-confident, very optimistic, and iGen is the opposite. Much more pessimistic about their own prospects and the prospects of the world, much less self-confident. I was just making a graph for this for my new book, which will be out in about a year, on all the generations. And you look at, say, life satisfaction or satisfaction with self among high school students, and that had been ticking upward for decades. And around 2012, right, as iGen shows up, it just plummets, and it just keeps going down like a black diamond ski slope. And this shows up for lots of other things, for happiness. And then it goes the opposite direction with steep upward trends for things like loneliness and depression and self-harm and suicide. There's a huge problem with mental health in this generation that existed even before the pandemic. And that's what concerns me the most about the generational trends, is this huge uptick in mental health issues.
Well, so if you were facing a panel of social media company executives and they said, well, can you prove that there's actually a connection between the use of social media on smartphones and all these things, because we don't believe that's true, what would you say?
I would say that if you use the standards of a civil suit, that the preponderance of the evidence points in that direction. And that's usually the standard of proof that's used. From a scientific point of view, can you absolutely prove it? No, because you can never absolutely prove causation of things over time. You can't do, say, the gold standard of an experiment because you can't randomly assign people to be born at different times. It's just impossible. Now, you can randomly assign people to have different experiences with phones. You can say, well, this group, you're going to cut back on your social media use. This group, you're not. But number one, that's really hard for people to do. So it's a very tough experiment to try to run. And it doesn't get to all of the web of causation because you're still living in 2021. You're still surrounded by other people who are all using social media. And there's downsides to that too for mental health, that if you choose not to use it, then you're left out. So there's these group level and network level effects, not just individual ones.
Right. So in your book, in your long picaresque book title, you talk about the issue of adulthood and that they're completely unprepared for adulthood. Say some more about that. Why do you say that? And what do you mean by adulthood? Help us understand that.
So that speaks to some trends which aren't entirely bad. They're really kind of a trade-off between bad and good, that teens are taking longer to grow up. So, for example, if you look at 12th graders, 17 or 18 years old, they are now much less likely to work at a paid job, to go out on dates, to have tried alcohol, to have their driver's license, to go out without their parents. So all of these things that were historically kind of milestones of adolescence, because of things that adults do and children don't do, teens just don't do them as much. So iGen is just getting a lot less experience with independence before they go to college and to the workplace compared to millennials, and especially compared to Gen Xers and boomers. And this is all from large and nationally representative surveys that have been done since the 1970s. So good, reliable sources. You put that together and people are pursuing what psychologists call a slow life strategy. Times and places when people live longer and education takes longer to finish, the whole trajectory of life slows down. Children and teens grow to independence at a much slower rate. And then young adults also take longer to achieve what have traditionally been the milestones of adulthood, like a stable career, getting married, and having children. So Gen Xers and millennials pioneered those trends of young adults taking longer to grow up. And then with iGen, you really see the impact on adolescence as well.
That's so interesting. So what are the implications for higher education and also for transition to entry-level jobs? Is that affected by this? I imagine it is.
It is, definitely. So if before the pandemic, I gave a lot of talks on college campuses, and folks who work in, say, student affairs would tell me over and over that this is the thing they have noticed the most about how students have changed in the last 10 or 15 years, that it used to be if the student had a problem with their grades or with their roommate, that the student would talk to the office. And now the parents call. And they say they have more and more students who can't make even simple decisions without texting mom and dad. And then the same has begun to show up in the workplace too, that you have entry-level employees who just come into those jobs without as much experience with independence and with decision-making. There's some big upsides to those trends as well. I'm not denying that at all, but we have to acknowledge that there's a key downside, which is that they're just not prepared. We're often, as parents, educators, often not giving teens and young adults the skills that they need to succeed in today's workplace, which is very often those skills are around decision-making and independence. And that's exactly what they're not getting enough experience with.
And taking it back to the use of media, smartphones, social media, et cetera, why would that result in a erosion of the locus of control that we would associate with adulthood or with the purposefulness? I mean, is it something at a more insidious level, like neurochemical or cognitive reshaping that somehow you could almost argue is an impairment, or is it something else?
Well, I think it's just a matter of life experience.
I see. You're just spending all your time looking at your phone. You're not spending your time doing other things.
Right. And I want to be clear too that it's not just technology, that the slow life strategy is a bigger cultural story, that it does, happen in places and times when there's a longer lifespan, when things are more stable. It happens across cultures as well. And it began before the smartphone. Those trends were already heading in that direction. But the smartphone and social media accelerated that because you get more things you can do at home. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
Right. So recently, China decided to regulate the amount of at least gaming usage. Sorry, I won't explain why I'm having these production issues, but suffice it to say that there are some issues today. They're drilling on the exterior of my building, so I'm actually live streaming from the powder room, and the powder room has an automated 30-minute cutoff to save electricity, and that's why I also have all the fuzz, because there's an RF source from somewhere in here. So, anyways, I understand what you're saying about. Oh yeah, so China. So they're saying, don't we're going to regulate the amount of time you spend doing games. There's clearly regulation of memes on social media and things of that kind. Could that have any impact on what we're talking about? I mean, should countries be reconsidering their policies around technology and social media because of this kind of, essentially, this public health problem that you're describing?
I think so. I mean, I think there's reasonable steps that can be taken. And the place to start is with the youngest teens. And that makes sense because that's where the mental health trends are the worst. The increase in self-harm and depression and suicide has been much largest in the youngest groups compared to the older ones. So one piece is that you're supposed to be 13 years old to have a social media account in your own name, but that is not always enforced. And the social media companies say it's because, well, how would we enforce it? But my viewpoint is, well, it's the law. It needs to be enforced. Right. I mean, can you imagine if we said, okay, the drinking age for alcohol is going to be 21. We can't really figure out how to enforce it, so we're only going to enforce it sometimes. I mean, that would never fly. So they make the case that, we'd have to ask for ID, and there's downsides in that and so on. But if there was some system to do that, say you had to use a credit card for it and put a charge of 5 cents or 1 cent on a card, then at least you'd have the permission of a parent or somebody who had a credit card who was at least 18, because we have 10, 11, 12-year-olds who are on social media, on Instagram, for example, who are not supposed to be there for good reason. And that the age limit of 13 is already way too low. It should probably be 16 or 18 if we're really thinking about development and how it works at those ages. 13 is actually exactly the worst time to be on social media. I mean, especially social media like Instagram, which at base invites teen girls to put pictures of themselves online so other people can comment on them. Mm-hmm. If you think about it that way, it is pretty clear that that's not a healthy influence on someone who's going through puberty.
Well, not to mention the abundance of pornography and violent stuff and, just social garbage and opinionated stuff, right? I mean, I think that part of the pessimism that you've observed is, a function of people preferring to post negative stories, right? I mean, the more lurid, the better, and the more fantastic, the better. and we live in this almost diluted or partially diluted state right now, at least as the United States, in terms of the eruption of all of these, kind of distorted and really delusional thoughts that social media just serves as an enormous amplifier for. And when you're 12 or 13 or 10, you don't really have the critical faculties to be able to, discern what is, false from what is true, and to contextualize some particularly disturbing images that you might see. I mean, it really is pretty terrible, I think. And I agree with you that things need to be done. But what can be done? Because and I guess that question boils down to a micro and a macro question, because, parents, right, can do things, or teachers, or, somebody local to the child, the young person. And then at a social policy level, it seems like things need to be done as well. So if you could wave magic wand and kind of fix all this, what would you be proposing?
Yeah, I think you need to do both. The problem with just relying on parents is, first, that's a pretty big burden for parents to take on. So I have 3 kids myself, so I know all about this daily battle around screens, especially because they need to use screens for all the good things they can be used for school, for looking up information. I mean, this is really hard because you want your kids to have all of the benefits, but then protect them from the downsides. And honestly, that's virtually impossible as a parent today, to walk that line. So that's problem one. The other problem is, again, if you say to your 15-year-old, you can't have social media, then they might be the only one in their class who doesn't have social media. And that has its own downsides. I mean, in my view, that outweighs the negatives of being that age and having social media, particularly for girls. But you can't win. This is what teens tell me all the time. If I'm on it, then I feel depressed. If I'm not, then I feel left out. I can't win. So that's why I think these larger solutions are a good idea, whether that's at the school level or the government level, or, I mean, I guess the smallest group solution you could get is groups of friends or parents who say, okay, we're not going to let, our kids be on social media until they're 16 or 17. And to try to make this a group level thing rather than just individuals.
A group, you mean like an affinity group, like a group of friends who come to an agreement, or what do you mean by group?
So it could be a group of friends. That's absolutely, one example. Or it could be at the level of a school. So a school could say, we're not going to allow smartphones during the school day. Kids need them before and after, but we're not going to allow them access during the school day. So then they're not a distraction in the classroom. And then they're also, maybe the kids will talk to each other at lunch. Imagine that.
Right. And then what about at the national level, at the policy level? Yeah, I mean, as you said, there's a drinking age law, there's a smoking, buying cigarettes law. Can we hope for anything from our legislators, or is that just a kind of a loss? They're just saber rattling, against Facebook, and then there'll be another election cycle.
Yeah, well, it is kind of hard to have faith that anything will get done. But there is bipartisan support. That's very rare these days, and so somewhat encouraging that there's, on both sides of the aisle, interest in more regulation in this area. And I think it's particularly true for the things I was mentioning about the age limit and enforcing it, and perhaps raising that age limit, just reforming the COPPA law so it reflects today's realities. And there is support for that.
Well, let's hope so. You're painting a somewhat daunting picture, I think, where there's a lot that needs to be done. It's not 100% clear of how it's going to get done, and certainly how it's going to get done at scale. And meanwhile, the toxic effects of the new technologies. I'm sure you're familiar with Tristan Harris's work, and the all of the work on ethical digital, and how companies are engineering their products to be essentially habit forming, if not addictive. There are, you could argue that the same logic applies to using your smartphone as to smoking in a way. But and to see it as a public health problem, I think, is actually a useful way of framing it, because we all believe that public health problems need to be resolved, and we want to be healthier. And up until now, a lot of the discussion around the tech has been about, our freedom and our rights, and we should be able to do whatever we want. But you're painting a picture that is sobering and very valuable. I'm gonna rush out and well, I don't even have to rush out. I'm going to push some buttons and order your book, and I think all of our viewers should do the same. So, well, thank you very much. I mean, I'm sure we could go on for another hour about this, because it's such a rich topic, and maybe we should entertain that thought. But meanwhile, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, appreciate it. All right. Well, good luck with your important work.
Thanks.
Okay. So I am going to see if I'm smart enough to